And so let's look at Mark in the Coptic church. I know there's a lot to digest, but again, Elizabeth Assichet, in a history of Christianity in Africa, listen to what she says here. She says, the Copts have never ceased to believe in the ancient tradition that St. Mark was the first apostle of Egypt and was martyred in Alexandria. Eusebius, in his church history, which was written about 324, about a year before the Council of Nicaea, he mentions this, and a much earlier fragment from Clement refers to Mark's presence in Alexandria, and that is from Clement of Alexandria. The Acts of Mark, which is a pseudepigrapha, were written in Greece in the late 4th or early 5th century, claiming that Mark first preached in Cyrene and was a Cyrenian Jew. So some of the earliest histories that we have put Mark on the continent of Africa as early as 40 AD. This is roughly about 70 years after the Jesus event at the cross and the resurrection. Mark, who was, watch now, a Cyrenian Jew, which means that he didn't just go to Africa and preach the gospel, he went home and preached the gospel. He went home, and it's just quite interesting now, is that often when Jesus would preach, and there would be those who wanted to follow Jesus, there were some that Jesus would say, go home. In other words, return to your oikos. Return to your areas where you have influence. Whether it is your immediate relatives, your extended family, your community. You'll notice in Acts 1 and 8, Jesus told them to start their preaching in their oikos. He says that you shall be witnesses unto me both in Jerusalem, then Judea, then Samaria, and then the uttermost parts of the earth. So they spiral out from their immediate center. Mark then follows this trajectory, this pattern of Jesus, and goes home and plants the church, which is today the oldest surviving church in the world, the Ethiopian Coptic Church. Tradition places Mark there. Let's talk about, so we have the African church there on the African continent as early as AD 40. But to the notion of the early church fathers in Africa, so I would be remiss if I don't dispel some of the rumors that have gone out. So just because one of the early church fathers was from Africa or lived in Africa does not particularly mean that they were black. So we got to be scholastically honest about that. There were some early church fathers who were black, but some of them that were from Africa or lived in Africa were not necessarily black. Many of them were Greeks or Romans that later moved there to Africa to study. Now, it goes without saying that Africa becomes the cradle of Christianity. And one of the reasons that it was so attractive for the early church fathers to go to Africa is because Africa had the largest scriptorium, the largest university, and the largest library of anywhere in the world. Were it not for Africa, the West could not exist. The model of the West was copied from Africa. Africa taught the world. And so Christianity then, what we know of as the hermeneutical process, those things were developed on the continent of Africa. So let's talk about some of the early church fathers who was African. So you've heard of Clement of Alexandria, right? He's one of the earlier founders of the catechetical school in Egypt. But he was not an African. He moved to Africa. He only lived there for a short time. He was Athenian. He was a Greek. And of course, Clement of Alexandria lived around the mid-2nd century, roughly around 150 AD. What about Origen? You've heard of him. Of course, he was also from Alexandria. Origen was black. How do I know? Well, he was born of mixed Egyptian and Alexandrian Greek parentage. And so he would have looked like a light-skinned black person looks today, with textured hair. He grew up a Christian and became the first major thinker of early Christianity. In fact, what we appreciate about Augustine is owed to the influence of Origen on Augustine's hermeneutical methodology. Tertullian, who was born roughly about 10 years after Origen, was a black father born in Carthage, North Africa. He was actually black. And then, of course, you have Athanasius of Alexandria. This is the man that debated Arius at the Council of Nicaea. His tutor was Alexander, Bishop of Alexandria. I would have you to know that although we do not know the ethnic description of these two men, I would have you know that the entire conciliatory movement, all of the councils, are owed to what was happening in Africa prior to Nicaea. In other words, African preachers were debating about Christology long before Nicaea ever took place. Sabellius, one of the earlier heretics, was from Africa, and so was Arius. African clergymen had within, whether it was the Eastern Church or the Western Church, the greatest concern for Orthodox Christology was found on the continent of Africa. They were debating biblical Christology, defending the faith against the heretics. And it was because of Athanasius and Bishop Alexander of Alexandria that they convinced Constantine to convene in Nicaea, Turkey, the council, which was to settle once and for all the issue of whether Jesus was homoousios, of the same substance, or homoousios, that is, of a similar substance. That position was debated by Arius. You have, of course, Augustine of Hippo. He was the bishop of Hippo, which is in modern-day Algeria. Augustine was of mixed breed, so he would have also looked like a light-skinned black man. And so there are many, many others that I could name that are lesser known. I wanted to just talk about some of the early ones. And again, all the fathers that lived in Africa or even born in Africa, some of them were just simply born in areas that were originally Greek polises and then later Roman territories, but they themselves were not ethnically African. So it's a little disingenuous to try and make every father from Africa black. Because, you know, white people do live in Africa today, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean that to be African all the time means to be black. But it goes without saying, it is still very important to underscore, because history has hid from us the fact that many of our most important fathers of Christianity were indeed African and were indeed black. And so it is very important to point that out. I'm almost done. If you just give me just a few more minutes and I'll open the floor. Let's talk about Coptic and Nubian Christianity. When we refer to Coptic Christianity, we're talking about Christianity in Egypt. When we talk about Nubian Christianity, we're talking about Christianity from the area of Ethiopia all the way down to the south in Nubia and the area of Abyssinia. So here's one important fact. This is really good. You're going to want to just kind of sketch this out and then go look it up when you get a chance. There was a king in Ethiopia by the name of Ezana. Now, this is really important because remember our friend, our brother, Athanasius? Where was Athanasius from again? He was from Alexandria, right? So he's from Egypt. And so Athanasius went through a whole lot after Nicaea. You know, he was exiled. They wanted to call him a heretic, all kinds of stuff. And he stood for the faith. And we owe a great deal of our Trinitarian faith to our brother Athanasius. But later, God, justified him. Not in the soteriological sense, but he vindicated him, I should say. And he was made to be the bishop of Alexandria. The interesting thing is that there were two men, two brothers. The more popular or the more known of the brothers, his name was Frumentius. And they had gone to the area of Ethiopia, and when they arrived there, everybody on the ship was killed except for Frumentius and his brother. I think his brother's name was Adenius or Adencius or something of the other. They were the only survivors, and they were made to be slaves of King Ezana, the king of Ethiopia. And again, that region was not modern Ethiopia, but it encompassed that part of the land and the areas to the south. Well, as a slave of Ezana, he becomes a tutor for King Ezana's son. And he teaches King Ezana and King Ezana's son about Christianity. His brother returns to Tyre, where they were from, up near the coast, the northern coast of Israel, near Sidon, and he becomes bishop there. But Frumentius begs Athanasius, the bishop of Alexandria, to support him in planting a church in Abyssinia and in the lower parts of Ethiopia. And he does, and he later becomes bishop there. Well, this is important because King Ezana is then converted, and the first nation that becomes entirely Christian is an African nation predominantly occupied by black people, and their king was a black man. King Ezana becomes a Christian, and this is roughly around 315. This is in the 4th century. Watch now, before Nicaea. And so as a result of Frumentius's evangelism, not only does a king come to Christ, but an entire nation comes to Christ, or becomes, quote unquote, a Christian nation. Not that everybody was a Christian. That's really important. There's another piece to consider about African Christianity, and that is during a later period in the 7th century. So we're talking roughly about 300 years past this, and the Axum Empire, or Abyssinia, Ethiopia, all that region, watch now, 300 years later, they're still Christian. They're still a Christian empire. And there was a king that they call Negus, Negus. Write that down. It is actually a title that in Amharic that actually means king. Negus, Negus. Negus is an Abyssinian Christian king. Now, I want to mention this because this is really game-changing from a historical standpoint. Islam typically fails to tell us about the first hijrah of Muhammad, the first flight. And so they'll say that Muhammad's first flight, typically, they'll say, was from Mecca to Medina, right? And they call that the first flight. But that was not the first flight. The first flight was to Abyssinia. When Islam had roughly about 20 converts, men from the Quraysh tribe had chased Muhammad and his band of followers through the desert, hoping to kill them. When they got to King Negus, they arrived there. King Negus gives Muhammad and his followers asylum, sanctum, refuge, and they leave there in 628. So how long do they stay? They stay roughly about 15 years under, watch now, the asylum of a Christian king and a Christian nation, so that historically it can be said that it was Christianity that saved Islam.